Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have another incredible episode for you guys today. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this on your Monday day afternoon commute as you guys are going back to work. Because, of course, you're listening to this live at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as it always is premiered. So hopefully you guys enjoy that. Today I've got a little bit of an abstract theme today for what we're going to discuss. We had some few news topics we had last week. I'll get into those later on and bring them in. But there's a bigger concept I want to deal with that I've seen a lot. I think I need to expand upon and talk about more that I'm seeing. And one thing I want to describe this as we're seeing a lot of our terminology and language being appropriated by more mainstream people. Look at the amount of people who say based. Look at the amount of people who say like red pills. All those type of things are now part of the mainstream conversation. You see that, and you also see a more performative, rhetorical extremism coming from, and by extremism, I'm not using that as negative. Maybe I'll say radicalism, because radical, is a little bit more, not as negative connotations as extremism, but a more radical rhetoric position coming from people that you see from more mainstream sources, at the same time that the right is, in a lot of respects, moderating a lot of its policy positions on a variety of issues. And I want to discuss that and what that means and what that says about the future of American politics. Where are we going with that when we see this radical rhetoric paired with moderated positions? Now, what prompted this idea or this discussion is that last week I was seeing, I think it was David Reboy or one of those type of people, Claremont type people, who was talking about how ineffective it is for Republicans to talk about Democrats are the real racists. And I was like, oh, that's a real improvement. That's something that you would have only heard people on the quote-unquote alt-right saying 5 or 6 years ago. Everyone else would have been like, this is an effective argument. This is really good. I'm glad we're doing this. We should no longer call Democrats the real racists. And that's a solid argument. And so it's like good that people are making that at those type of arguments. But at the same time, you're seeing that the right is not fully going into the course that we want. And now it's not saying that this is a black pill. It's just more of saying, I always try to have to emphasize that things aren't black pilled. I'm not saying like, oh, all hope is lost, all is whatever. I'm just trying to say, observe what's happening and give people an accurate and realistic portrayal of what's happening. So you're seeing people like that say that. But at the same time, they are, people from the Claremont sphere, and that's not a full-on attack on the Claremont sphere. For them, they do some good work. A lot of the stuff they do is pretty goofy. But one of the goofy things they did is that, I talk about this a lot, is that Donald Trump had a 1776 commission at the end of his presidency that was supposed to challenge critical race theory, that was supposed to say, set a new tone for how we teach American history to school children. And what it came out to is simply saying Democrats are the real racists, but intellectually, from a historical perspective, because it blames all of our identity politics, both white and black, on racist Democrats like John C. Calhoun, and the Republicans are the true racial egalitarians. So it is a highbrow version of Democrats are the real racists, and this is what they propose they want to teach the kids in school. And they're also doing this with the Florida education plan too, that is being crafted by a lot of these Claremont, Hillsdale people, a lot of the people in Conservative Inc. who went more pro-Trump during his presidency, and now they're all ready for DeSantis. They propose this plan to teach school children in Florida like American history, American civics. And it comes out to the same, Democrats are the real racists, Republicans are the real racial egalitarians. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily a step back, because Republicans have been saying this stuff for years. I mean, you can go back to Ronald Reagan's presidential campaigns, and he was making a lot of the same arguments that you see Republicans making 40 years later. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's something new or a step back, but I do want to say is that when they appropriate a lot of our language, the language doesn't carry the same meaning, or the arguments that they use aren't being made in the same way that the alt-right, dissident right, were making years ago. And it's the same way you could see this with based. Based, when it meant, when the right was using it 5 or 6 years ago, it clearly meant, dissident right. That's what meant base. Like saying, somebody saying something base would have been like, it's time to deport all immigrants. Okay, that would have been based. Or saying, Donald Trump saying, pushing the Muslim ban. Or Donald Trump saying, we don't want any immigrants from shithole countries. That would have been what we would have said as base. But base meaning has changed. Now you see libertarians trying to appropriate it. Not only do you see, and libertarians are using it to appropriate like tax cuts. And I was even worried about this back in 2017 because base took a longer time than red pill to get into the mainstream. And I was already seeing, in 2016, 2017, people misappropriate the meaning of red pill. Red pill, as used by the dissident right, circa 2015, 2016, really meant that you understood the score, that you understood race, that you understood sexual dynamics, but primarily race, and you understood the true history of the world and those type of things. That's like the type of red pills. Then red pill just meant that you are now like anti-woke. You could be a like centrist or an anti-woke liberal, and you could be red pilled because you see that the Democrats and their government policies really hurt people, and Republican policies are actually support people. And it's something that basic, and that was already being misappropriated in 2017. I was seeing people like saying like, this is a real red pill, and it's like about tax cuts or something. And now that's basically it, is like the red pills. We're just talking about like how, Democrats are the real racists. That would be a red pill that you would see people banner around and say that that's what it's a part of. And base took a little bit more time. I think it was primarily in 2021 where it began, where the right began losing its control over it and what it's meaning. And even leftists use base. I mean, they will always see people with transgender flags, and they'll be saying like how we need to have mandatory HRT for all like school age children, and they're like based, and it's like, I think that's the opposite. I think that's the complete opposite of that. And so you'll see, so it's been widely misappropriated by multiple people, and now that its popularity doesn't mean that America's political discourse is getting more based. It just means people are more misappropriating. And it's the same with red pill and a lot of these other arguments that you see. And a lot of people speak our language and, take what we're saying, but they, change the meanings behind it. And I always like to point out Christopher Rufo. Rufo absolutely takes our language. I mean, you can see him say NGMI, not going to make it. You see him not even just saying red pill, but you see white pill, black pill. He speaks our language all the time, but it's not using, but he has different goals from us. And the meanings of the words he's using is different from how the dissident right uses it. And you could say this is in some ways a part of the victory, but it's not the complete victory you have, because once you lose control over the language and once you lose control over the meanings, then it becomes effectively cringe. It becomes meaningless. It's like how people saying base, like I only like saying base ironically now. I prefer keyed because keyed has a set meaning of what it stands for, while base has changed from leftists use it for transgender education for children. Libertarians use it for like open borders, and conservatives use it for tax cuts. So it's like completely changed what it means, and that's how society is using it. And even normies are using based in completely idiotic ways. So you have to have a term that when it's said, like the core group knows what it means, and it specifically means like good in a dissident right eyes, that it's actually based in what we're in our ideological standpoint, not just that like it's good or awesome by a neutral standpoint. It has a specific meaning that it's supposed to say, and we're not going to let people misappropriate it to mean industrial policy or family or family tax credits or whatever. It's like that people, and like some person who would say this, and it was also funny with like populist think types have like decided like in 2021 that like based is their term, which they're like already behind on using this. And they would get mad that like libertarians are using our word, and like I saw like Patrick Deneen like trying to claim that like libertarians are stealing his word. I'm like Patrick Deneen is this Notre Dame law professor who tries to claim he's a post-liberal. He wrote a book on liberalism, anti-liberal book a few years ago that Barack Obama praised, not plays. Yeah, praised, and so he's like a major figure, but he tries to pretend that he invented these rhetoric, which even though like 2 years ago or in 2019 he would have just said, "Oh, what is based on what?" And now he tries to say that like, "Oh, the libertarians are stealing our language." And there's all these people who try to say that they're the arbitrator of what it means. Several years after the fact. There's also them like trying to take vaporwave aesthetics, several years after it had died, and said that it was like theirs, and like they would claim that like a leftist event was using vaporwave, and they'd say they're stealing our aesthetics, and it's like, I think you guys stole this aesthetics from like the alt-right circa 2015. So that's how like something to say is, but the reason why they use this rhetoric and adopt a lot of the aesthetics is that they can see that there's a lot of power to it. That there's a cool language about this, and they want to be seen as cool by the Anons and get their support, but they also want to make sure that the Anons ideology doesn't come to the fore. That ultimately that the ideology that they're promoting is using the coding of the dissident right, but in a lot of its objectives, it's the same as Conservative Inc. It ultimately is. You can see this with their history plans about how they're challenging critical race theory and what they wanted to replace it as. And it always comes down to a colorblindism and saying that all men are created equal and talking about Martin Luther King. They may be using our language to promote it, and they may be using like vaporwave aesthetics to have an event challenging critical race theory. But ultimately what it is, when you take away the new aesthetics and take away the language, a lot of it is the same old Conservative Inc. dressed up in dissident right paint. Now, this is not a total negative, because some of the concepts that they introduce, can move people in a greater direction. One thing that is interesting is that a lot of these people are talking about more about Carl Schmitt and a lot of these radical right-wing thinkers that you would say that people would have ignored and not talked about. It's like, oh, you can't talk about that person's dangerous. But now people love to cite Schmitt, and they're like, people need to know about the friend-enemy distinction. And I think some of this stuff is good, and also like Sam Francis is getting somewhat rehabilitated, and some other good people like that, and that is mostly a good thing. But I don't think it is the unquestionable or complete 100% positive that people want to say it is, because it does come at the expense is that they basically find the things that are least offensive about these figures, and then they promote this idea. Or they just simply say these stuff of buzzwords, like the friend enemy distinction is like them saying this, like, you guys need to understand this, like, politics is the game of punishing your enemies and rewarding your friends. And some of the stuff they treat as like revelations, but it's like been the basic of politics for a long time, even American politics, regardless of whether they read Carl Schmitt or not. And some of that is good. I ultimately think that it is good, but there is like a cringe aspect to it, and they also forget important aspects of a lot of these thinkers. I think Sam Francis is definitely one of the thinkers that they try to boulderize and censor a lot of the stuff that made him most interesting, but primarily about his stuff about race. And instead they just focus in on him talking about the managerial elite and how they're into this stuff and how they're bad, and we need a working class revolution, a middle American revolution to take them on. And they try to ditch all of his racialism and his racial thinking, which was a core component of Francis, and is a lot of what made him a very interesting thinker. And I think a lot of the stuff that he's talking about, the managerial elite, maybe isn't as relevant today as it was when he was writing it then. Or I don't think it is as aged well or as important. While I think a lot of his stuff on race is incredibly important and is worth reading, but the conservatives just want to focus on what's not going to get them canceled by citing Francis. But I ultimately think that it's good that people are talking about Francis, because then that will get them to read his less politically correct essays and ideas, and people seeing his name more will make them read it, and so that'll wake up more people. So I think that that's good, but it's not. It does come with a kind of a cringe aspect and a balderized aspect of what these people are supposed to be, and it leads to kind of silly ideas. I do get a little tired of the people just like, Papa saying this, like, I have a brilliant idea. You guys haven't thought about that. Friend enemy distinction. It's like, okay, we've heard about this. This is kind of such a basic idea, and some of it, doesn't lead to the exact like winning or victory that people think it will. That's a subject for another discussion. But I don't think I wouldn't say it's mostly a bad thing. I would say it's mostly a good thing that their guys are getting into this. With all that said, with people talking about how DR3 is stupid and citing Carl Schmitt, you would think that the right is moving in a more radical direction. And in some ways, it is on certain issues, but in other ways, it's not. And I think you could look at this, as I talked about in last week's IQ Supplement about the gay marriage fight, is that last week, 47 Republicans voted to affirm gay marriage, the legality of gay marriage. 47 Republicans, House Republicans. That was a very high number, and I argued in the IQ supplement it probably would have been higher if the issue was not tied to the Supreme Court's abortion decision, because the main argument being used against the affirming gay marriage or codifying it was not saying gay marriage is against my religion. It's an abomination. I cannot support that. It was simply saying that this bill is just a way to attack the Supreme Court and their abortion decision, and that's why I'm voting against it. And you could see many people using this argument, people like Jim Jordan, Matt Gaetz. That was the primary argument being used against it. It was not an argument against gay marriage. It was an argument against the politicization of the Supreme Court's abortion decision, and that they thought that this was an attack on the Supreme Court. So that was the main reason that was used. Now, and it's now going to the Senate. And it looks like the Senate, they're going to find 10 Republicans to vote for it. There are already 5 Republicans who said that they would support it. And it's not necessarily the people you would imagine. It's not necessarily the total liberals. It's like one of the most conservative members, Ron Johnson, said he's going to support it. And he criticized it on the same grounds. He's like, Democrats are trying to invent an issue, that there was no issue, and that they're just trying to attack the Supreme Court, but ultimately I'm going to support it. And there's a couple of other people who are making these arguments too. And the other 4 Republicans are Tom Tillis, who's a pretty bad Republican, but he's not usually seen as that wishy-washy or liberal on social issues. He said he's going to support it. Susan Collins said she's going to support it. Lisa Murkowski, both of them are very moderate Republicans. Obviously, they're not that surprising. And then Rob Portman, who is a pretty establishment Republican, but generally goes to the right on social issues. He says he's going to vote for it because he has a gay son. They're going to find at least 5 more Republicans to vote for it. And that is a huge change from even 2015, before the Obergefell decision. They would have not found 47 Republicans to vote for gay marriage in 2015, in 2016. Maybe even in like 2019, they wouldn't have found 47 House Republicans to vote for it. But now they can find enough Republicans to make this law. And that is a major change on that issue. And there's a couple of other issues too that have been changed in that direction. I think criminal justice reform, which, a lot of the right talks about the anarchy in our streets, but you have to remember is that the right, most Republicans voted for criminal justice reform with the First Step Act. And after George Floyd, a majority of Republicans wanted to vote for a truncated criminal justice reform plan. And when it comes to like police and cops, most right wingers will just see any type of police shooting and a lot of them will just immediately talk about like, fuck the pigs, I hate police. We gotta be anti-police in that. And so that's like one thing that's changing. The ones that are changing in a more right-wing direction or more like committed direction, I would say, are immigration, abortion. You could say guns, but Republicans have been pretty solid on guns for at least 20 years. They were open to gun control measures in the 90s due to the crime wave that we had in the 90s. But today, you would never see Republicans support gun rights. But on immigration, they've definitely moved to the right. You've seen, a few years ago, you wouldn't have seen any Republicans talk about immigration restriction. Now, a lot of Republicans on the campaign trail to emphasize their conservative bona fides, they'll say that I'm for reducing legal immigration, not just illegal immigration. And also, hardly any Republican wants to openly support a mass amnesty. There are a handful, but this is a huge difference from 2013, where there was at least a third of Republicans were in favor of some form of amnesty, and the Republican Party said we have to support amnesty to survive, and they're now not seeing that. You do see a lot of Republicans vote for some form of amnesty. There was a few weeks ago, I think it was like 60 or so Republicans voted for an expanded immigration process. And you still see things like that. They're not perfect on immigration, but they are far better on immigration than even in the 2016 presidential campaign. Even I would say even in the, during Trump's term, they are certainly better on immigration than they have been since like the 1920s or 30s. I think you would have to go back a long time to find Republicans as good. They're not as good as they were back then, but they're better than they have been in the post-65 America than at any point. So for the last 60 or so years, this is at the best point that they're on immigration. And on abortion, there were still pro-choice Republicans in the 2000s. There were also the mainstream position among Republicans was, abortion restrictions with rape and incest exceptions. And now the standard is, total abortion ban. There is no way a pro-choice Republican could ever get elected. I mean, outside of like New England, like I think that Massachusetts Republican governor, or I think he might not no longer be the Republican governor. I forget, but I think he may have been pro-choice, or pro-abortion. Being a pro-abortion Republican, you cannot survive in the party anymore. And also, it's a controversial to even say you support exceptions. I think they were attacking Dr. Oz for supporting rape and incest exceptions. So those show changes. But at the same, and even on sometimes like on race issue, Republicans may be not as moving further to the right as we think on a lot of these matters. You have to remember, only 14 Republicans voted against Juneteenth. And I think, if that bill had been proposed 10 years ago, I think there had been more Republicans saying no to it. You also don't see very many Republicans criticize Martin Luther King when you had, a large effort, which the remaining conservative Southern Democrats and a bunch of Republicans opposing Martin Luther King Day in the 1980s. You are seeing more conservatives question Martin Luther King and question, and bringing up the adultery accusations, bringing up the, plagiarism, bringing up and mentioning that if he was alive today, he would be supporting Black Lives Matter. You do have conservative commentators willing to criticize Martin Luther King, but you don't necessarily see that coming from Republican politicians. And even a lot of the arguments about affirmative action, affirmative action, a lot of the arguments like 20 years ago was centered on how it's anti-white. And today, a lot of the rhetoric centers around how it's anti-Asian. Even though they were bringing up the Asian factor 20 years ago, it was primarily that, it's hurting white people. But now they try to they just try to say that it's primarily discriminating against Asians. And there was one time there was this elite school in Northern Virginia that had implemented these new standards to increase racial equity, whatever they want to call it, and it noted a plunge in Asian students, but an increase in white students, and all these conservatives were outraged that they made the school slightly whiter. And so it's not used as largely, affirmative action is not usually attacked on anti-white grounds, it's usually attacked on anti-Asian grounds. And sometimes even like on anti-Jewish grounds, I don't know, there's all this times affirmative action is anti-Asian and anti-Semitic. So it's trying to appeal to the left standards of what is offensive and what is wrong, rather than pointing out the major factor in it that it's anti-white. But they want to appeal to the left, and they're like, the left isn't going to be won over by appeals to how it's anti-white racism, so we have to say it's anti-Asian or anti-Semitic or whatever. It's all about appealing to the left standards. And even I see that when people are trying to cancel like left-wing journalists, and like we have to go after them and find dirt on them. And the only way you can really cancel them is by appealing to the left standards. So you have to find that they've either been like a Me Too situation, or that they said something racist or anti-Semitic or homophobic when they were a young person. That's like the only way you can cancel them. But they can get away with like vicious anti-white racism or violent fantasies directed towards Republicans. They can get away with that, and that should be, you're like, well, if they said this about black people, they would of course been fired. But there's a different standard when it's applied to whites and Republicans. And other things is like I've seen a more extremist rhetoric, but there's more acceptance of pop cultural norms that they wouldn't have accepted in the 90s and 2000s. Like the popularity of rap among all sectors of the right, that's a major change. You would have seen people even in the 90s like criticizing rock music. I don't know if that was a good thing, but now you see like everyone like, they're like, we live in a degenerate culture. We live in this evil satanic culture. And then they're like, I love rap music. I'm listening to all this great rap music. And you're like, wait, what? There's a dissonance there that occurs. So there is a change on the right in the rhetoric that they're using and how they're using, but it doesn't necessarily fully translate to changes in position. And the immigration stuff is happening, I think, independent of the rhetorical shifts, and that's what we're mainly concerned with. I mean, it is like you could see the potential for people to move in the right direction on race issues, and I think like the fact that Tucker Carlson has made The Great Replacement like a mainstream talking, our mainstream part, or a part of mainstream political discourse, is a huge change in how we see the problem, and opens up the possibility for immigration restriction to be more popular and for people to openly discuss race in a meaningful way, rather than just like going to anti-white hysterics or retreating to colorblind denialism. So there are opportunities there. There are changes that are happening that wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago. But at the same time, people need to realize that it's not all going in our direction for a lot of these candidates. And a lot of people, even if you're looking at some of the like Mayra Flores, the Hispanic woman who won down in Texas, is like she's like promoting like amnesty and other things. And people are like, she's so base, but she's imitating a Trump style. And there is for a lot of right-wing politics, I actually, everyone knows I'm a huge Trump loyalist and that, but I do think that there is a problem is that people adopt Trump stylings, as this woman does, Flores does in Texas, but at the same time, it's not actually Trump policies. It's not actually America First policies that she's adopting, but she's adopting this kind of entertainment, WWE, like red, white, and blue aesthetic and Americana and like in-your-face politics, but at the same time it's advocating for a much more liberal, I don't know if liberal would be, but a much more moderated stance than you would have thought of as Trump's America First agenda in 2016. So there is a threat that becomes there's a greater emphasis on style over substance, and that the style comes to matter more than substance, and it will make up for having, cringe or cucky substance when your style is like, oh, we're owning the libs with this base Latina, and this is so epic, and then she like gets in office and she's voting for amnesty. There's something to worry about there, and I think that you do see that a lot. There was also problems with that with the Trump administration, that people were celebrating Trump decriminalizing homosexuality in Botswana or whatever. And it's like, that's not America First. Like, why do we care about this issue? And so some people will just like celebrate it in a way, as long as it's like done in a Trumpian style, they don't care what happens for this on the substance. And so I'm not one. There's like dorks who are like, style matters more than substance, or substance matter than substance matter more than style. We have to focus just on substance and civil debate. And you need that Trumpian style there, but you also need the substance the America First policy positions to make it whole. You just can't hope to have a WWE entertainer who's advocating for amnesty and Juneteenth and advocating for all these terrible positions and advocating for criminal justice reform and like a George Floyd national holiday. You can't have that. You need somebody who's going to stand up for the historic American nation with their policies. You just can't hope that somebody does, has the right style. Now I'm going to carry on this theme into later discussions we're going to have before I get to the cognitive elite questions. There's other aspects to this. And one thing I'm starting to see a lot of is our side claiming that we need to do more extreme rhetoric to counter the left's extreme rhetoric, and that by having more extreme rhetoric and using terms such as pedophile or demon, that this is a way to counteract the left's accusations of racist or sexist. And I've seen some of that. And some of that is like countering the left, and others is that the more extreme rhetoric we do, the more likely you push the Overton window over. And so I guess I need to go. This is a two-part thing that I need to address. I am skeptical of both arguments for reasons that I'll go into right now. The one thing I'll go with, like the demon or pedophile or that, I think the demon and pedophile thing are two different things, but I'll go into the demon one, is that I've heard a lot of people say, and I was seeing this like last week when I tweeted out about like, I don't really get the demon posting, people say that, it's an effective argument, but I feel that it's more likely to make ordinary people who are not yet converted think you're kooky and you're just weird and they just don't want to listen to you. But our side says that like, well, the left calls us racist, so we need a stronger term to attack them with. And by saying they're demons, we persuade people, because ordinary people see them as actual metaphysical evil, like actual evil spirits, and they're won over to this argument. And that's not necessarily the case. The one thing is that our society teaches everyone from very early age that the worst thing you could possibly be, besides being a sex offender, is a racist. That is drilled into people's minds from time that they are a kindergarten throughout their life. Nobody wants to be seen as racist. No one wants to announce themselves as a racist, and people fear that label. And so when the left uses it, they're appealing to the system ideology and the system rules to cast you down. And generally, the ordinary person is not going to investigate whether you're a racist or not. They're just going to simply say, this authority figure, whether it's a newspaper or, some government official or whatever, says you're a racist. I'm going to believe that you're a racist because I trust, CNN to tell me who's a racist. And there's a lot of people like that. Granted, there's a lot of conservatives who are waking up to that, and they'll say, well, if the New York Times calls you a racist, they call all Trump supporters racist, so I'm not going to believe the New York Times. So there's a lot of people like that. That's a positive development. But for most of the ordinary people, they feel that, that they're going to trust the authority figures when they say racist. And there also come certain consequences for being racist. Facebook has a policy specifically banning anyone who's deemed a white nationalist and anyone who's deemed a racist, and you will be banned from their content. And there's also banks and others who have these policies that we will not serve people who are spreading hate. And so you have to avoid these standards. Now, when it comes to demons, if you're raised in a very conservative Christian household, actually, I don't even know how many people. A certain conservative, we'll just say this, conservative Christian household, even though I think there's some exceptions to this, you would see demons as bad, and you don't want to be demonically possessed. You've probably seen The Exorcist. That's pretty bad. But for the average person, that's like crazy talk. That's associated with like crazy people. Like calling everything racist is not associated with insanity in the way that ranting about demons or aliens or what have you is associated with like crazy people. It's such a theme that in movies, like when you're calling out demons or some evil that they're like, how could someone think about this? Even in horror movies where there's an actual evil haunting people, they're like, there's no way there's a demon here. But when you talk about like the demons in the political context, it's not necessarily appealing to an authority. You're not appealing to this, very devout, very traditionally Christian population anymore. I mean, the American population, only about 61%, 62% is Christian. It says they're Christian, which is a huge is a huge decline among the American population. And a lot of those Christians are not the fire and brimstone Christians that we would have seen in America's past. They're very, when they think of demons and evil, they generally associate it with racism and things that the dissident right may espouse. They see that as the true evil, not like whatever the right is using for demons, are calling out as demons. And so instead of becoming an effective persuasion tool where you're going up to an ordinary person and saying, that person's a demon, they're going to be like, that's crazy talk. That's an insanity. And you're not even appealing to what they view as good and evil anymore. They view demons in the same category as talking about the Illuminati or aliens and just something far-fetched and just like something that a crazy person talks about. Well, when they hear racist, this message is amplified anytime they turn on TV or watch advertisement or read a newspaper, that there is a huge racism problem in America and there's racists lurking about, and you need to trust authority figures to spot these racists. So if you go up to that ordinary person and say, this person is a racist, they'll be like, oh, really? And then all you have to say is like, yeah, the New York Times says so. And they're like, oh, well, I'm not going to associate with that. Well, when you go up to a person and like, this person's a demon, you're like, what? And like, who says that? I do. And you're like, security? It's like that cartoon where it's like the Chad goes up and hits on a woman and it's like, oh, I love you. And then there's like the fat loser who does, it's like, hello, HR. That's how it's done with like racists. Like the Chad leftist is going up, that person's a racist. Like, oh, I so believe you, Chad. And then the weird fat guy's like, that person's a demon. Like, hello, security. That's how it's portrayed. It's not actually this effective propaganda tool. And as I always talk about, the one thing we need to avoid is looking like cranks and maniacs and just like, because people already think that our ideology is extreme and insane and radical and just fit for people who should be in the loony bin. And our purpose is to dissuade them when they actually come and interact with us. And you shouldn't double down on extremism and like far out rhetoric that is not going to appeal to the ordinary person. And the stuff about like the demon posting, I understand that like some people are going to believe that, and I'm not going to tell you what to not believe, but it's not an effective persuasion tool. It's just a way that, and I think this is a problem that I want to emphasize as a theme for this whole podcast, is that for a lot of the right, they come on to Twitter and to the online sphere, not so much to understand truth, not so much to change the world, but to get entertained, to be entertained. And that's like the nature of modern politics. That's been the nature of politics all the time. Like people, it's a hobby, it's a form of entertainment. And I always understand that point. Like people are into this because they're genuinely motivated by this. This is their real passion and hobby in life. That's just the nature of politics. But I think people take the entertainment too far, where they're like, I want to be entertained. I want the most extreme rhetoric. I want this, I want the fun stuff in there. I want this to be treated like a video game. And so, telling them like, hey, this is like scaring people away. They're like, no, you're taking away my entertainment. I have to be entertained. I have to call these people demons. I want to pretend I'm in Diablo 2. And the demons are like the SPLC or whatever. And so people will just like insist on that. And they don't really have to confront these ideas in the real world, because a lot of times they're just, this is like their little side hobby that they maybe keep from their friends and family. They have the anonymous account. That's just the nature. I'm not criticizing that and anonymity or in that regard, or people doing that. That's like the nature of the world that we're in. But they're not actually bringing these ideas out into the real world. They're not going to be talking to their friends about like demons, or maybe there's some people are. But I think if you're actually bringing it up to your normal friends and family, they're like, I think there's something wrong with Dave. He's talking about, he's just like getting in these long rants about demons. And so they associate that with a loony bin, while they associate accusations of racism with authority figures and that they should listen to. But the good news is for a lot of conservatives, they're just no longer going to listen to that. But for a lot of course, liberals and centrists and independents, they're going to listen to that no matter what. So that's the one thing to keep in mind on that. And then just like to, to carry on to the pedophile or groomer, rather, I think that's a little bit different. Like the groomer, pedophile, maybe pedophile would be in the same with demon. It does appeal to what people hate. I will say that, or what people really have a strong taboo against. Like calling somebody a pedophile is probably worse than calling somebody a racist. I think even in our society, they're unfortunately on a similar scale, but I think pedophile is probably worse than racist. To be called racist, I think most people would probably rather be called a pedophile, or not, would rather be called a racist than a pedophile. So I understand that there's like a strong emotional argument when it comes into that. But it's also, once again, you're not appealing to institutional authority or figures when you're saying pedophile. You're just kind of like going with the next extreme thing. It could potentially work. I think groomer, when the people hear pedophile, they may think that well, that might be too strong of a term or something, which I do think groomer comes into a better category, and it's ambiguous enough that it's not like saying you directly want to have, you're wanting to directly sexually assault kids. You're instead grooming them into a lifestyle that could have harmful effects for them. And that's really what grooming is. And so when the groomer debate came up on around the Florida bill, the anti-groomer bill, I didn't have that much of a problem with it. I didn't think it was as brilliant as a rhetorical move as people said, but I don't think it's a negative rhetorical move where people are just going to think you're crazy or loony for it. And you are describing and the way you're trying to describe the bill as it's going to be put in the hands of these teachers that libs of TikTok highlights on a regular basis and says, do you want these people to be telling your second grader about sex? No. And would you consider that grooming? They'd probably say, yeah. And so I think the groomer thing, I don't think that made the bill more extreme or loonier because that. I don't think that somebody's going to think that you're a loon by saying that. And I think if you're in a direct conversation with a normie, you could probably potentially win them over to saying that, there's a lot of groomers out there among these people, because you're not directly accusing them of pedophilia. You're saying that they're just warping these young minds and pushing them into a harmful life path, which I think most people would agree with. And there's a way to become off as a reasonable person who can win over normies. I don't think you could do that with demons. So that's the one thing I want to say about that. And going further into this is about pushing the most extreme violent rhetoric. There is a way of pushing the Overton window. I got into debated about this with some friends over that. And because I've seen people who, they'll just tweet stuff when they see something like a crazy thing from libs of TikTok or some teacher doing something crazy, they're death penalty or life in jail. And they'll just and some people just tweet this they imagine that this is going to happen just because they tweet it. And that's not necessarily the case. Actually, once again, saying not necessarily. Some people say I say that too much on the show, but I don't care. It's my trademark phrase. So they're saying that. And some people think that by saying it that they're going to make it happen. But it ultimately goes back to my point about the entertainment factor, where people kind of log in to vent about the crazy world they see on a daily basis and how there's a lot of things going to hell. And they just want to say the most offensive things and extreme things to vent. And there's a time and place for that, but I think it's also, by venting and going with extreme rhetoric, saying all these teachers who teach groomers need to have life in jail. And it's people think that by tweeting it, that they're actually making it happen. But in actual society, the people facing life in jail are people who walked around the Capitol without permission. Well, are facing a long time in jail. While these teachers are more likely to win medals and honors from blue states for grooming kids, or for teaching gender identity to gender ideology to third graders. That's the type of stuff that's going to be actually rewarded. They're not actually going to face consequences for their actions. And I think sometimes we go with the because people are just searching for retweets and engagement, that they go with the most overblown extreme rhetoric to say that like this, and this like entertains people, and they hit retweet and like, and they're like, yeah, let's do that. And then like, of course, nothing happens to this person. And, it's just simply venting. No, I don't think this is necessarily negative, but I don't think it's really pushing the Overton window or anything. I think it's just a easy way to get engagement and things. And maybe in respects that if, a lot of people are getting upset about this issue, they can get, they're seeing like congressmen are seeing like people getting really fired up about it and like demanding life in jail for this. Like maybe they'll go and do something about it. But otherwise, I think it ultimately acts as a lot of entertainment rather than like, real solutions. Because you can go on Gab and you can see them like talking about like the craziest penalties and punishments for things that they disagree with. And, it's just people talking in the ghetto to themselves and firing themselves up. And ultimately, a lot of that kind of violent, extreme rhetoric can lead to negative consequences where, some maniac decides to go actually do real world violence rather than just tweeting about it. And we've seen many instances of that. And that's really something that we have to clamp down on because, they're going to use those incidents as pretexts to crack down on any and all dissidents. So that's something to worry about. I sometimes it's like harmless on Twitter, talking about like life in jail for groomers or whatever. I don't think that's like harmful, but I think it's, it's giving a false sense of what can actually happen in the real world. And too many times we focus in on fantasy of what we think should happen rather than what actually can happen. And so that's just something to think about in that regard. I don't know. I don't think it necessarily moves the Overton window, but if enough people are saying this and like getting really hyped up about these incidents that they're upset about, then yeah, you can make change. Now, the other thing I want to discuss that pairs in with this theme is the number of polls that are showing that Americans expect a civil war to break out. I think there was one new one saying that about half of Americans half of Americans expect America to break out in a civil war sometime shortly, sometime in the near future. Another group, nearly 1 in 3 Americans said that it may be necessary to take up arms against the American government. And you keep seeing a lot of these polls where you see a larger number of Democrats support political violence. Sometimes you see increasing numbers of Republicans support political violence. And you say like, well, maybe the country's coming apart. And Mystery Grove Publishing, some of you guys should be a fan of them, and many of their great books that they put out. That person, we'll call him MG for the show. MG always points out, like, you see a lot of people talking about this, and you see a lot of people posting about it on Twitter, on various other social media platforms. You see them telling pollsters this. But where is the evidence for the developing of this happening? Where do you see right-wing violence breaking out? Now, you may say January 6th. What happened in January 6th? Like, over 700 people. It might even be up to 800 people now got arrested and faced severe federal charges for that. Do you see the type of violence and the type of groups and the type of institutions that the left has, that the left is ready to deploy at a moment's notice to riot and cause destruction in the city and to get away with that type of violence? No, not quite. And a lot of this stuff, it goes back to the entertainment posting where people just think that all these problems are going to build up, and then one day people are just going to suddenly rise up and wipe away all the problems through civil war or national divorce or what have you. I always bring up this one instance of how I think people think that revolutions happen. And the movie V for Vendetta, different from the graphic novel. In V for Vendetta, there's just, the main character V. I'm actually forgetting the characters' names, but the guy is wearing the Guy Fawkes mask. He's like telling the people the truth, and they're like, wow, I didn't believe this. And they're watching this on like a nice TV and their nice apartment and their nice house with nice furniture, and they're just like, really, it's like, wow, the government is lying to us? Whoa, we're going to take the revolution. So just one day they see a television cast saying, the government is lying to you. They're just so bad. And they're like, they look around at their nice house and their nice family with a nice TV, nice furniture, and they're just like, I'm going to go join a revolution. And sure enough, they go and join a revolution. And that is not how revolutions work in real life. Like, there's generally a lot of deprivation going on. You can look at a Russian Revolution that occurred because people were starving and they saw a government that, had a weak response to it because a lot of their military and police were out on the front lines fighting World War One, and you saw a lot of the troops mutiny, and there was a breakdown in order, a breakdown in law, and people were actually suffering mass deprivation of food. They were like, we kind of turned to violence because we're not eating. And that happened in, even in the French Revolution, there was a lot of that was going on. There was a degree of deprivation. Sometimes I always like to say it's like, the current system that is overthrown, or the system that's overthrown in a revolution, gives concessions and makes itself weak, but then the disappointed expectations is what leads to revolution. You can argue that, but generally there's much more extreme circumstances. It's not that just one day the Russians were just living a great life in their nice house, and then they heard the government was lying to them and they overthrew them. And that's what a lot of Americans think that's going to happen. If you see, people are getting fed up with the current order. People are not happy with the current state of things. I mean, you can look at polling where people talk about the future of the country. Most people have a grim outlook on the future of the country. People do see partisanship happening, creeping into their daily lives. They do see America on the wrong track. But that does not necessarily mean a civil war, because even if you look back at our Civil War, you have to have institutions backing it for it to really occur. And that occurred in the Spanish Civil War. You really have to look at the history of these wars and revolutions to see what factors are here. Do we have institutions that would be on the right side or the red state of America in a civil war? Not really, except for if you count GOP and police unions. And generally the people who are most avid for the Civil War option want to abolish the GOP and police unions. And they're not even like that eager for this. And then, do you have like states that can just break off with nothing happening? No, not quite. All these states are heavily dependent on the federal government for subsidies and many other things. And they don't even have full control over the National Guard. So they don't really have these, factors. And there are many other factors. I don't want to belabor this point because I've talked about this many times in the podcast. But you don't really, and mainly, most importantly, is like a lot of these people who are upset still have a degree of prosperity that would be unthinkable at another time. And they're not thinking about civil war. But they are very upset. And they do want changes, but they're not necessarily, ready to take an AR-15 out into the woods and, fight federal agents or whatever. That's not what they're thinking. They're thinking more about like they're hoping politicians and the system as is can respond to their needs. And there's still a degree of way that can happen. And I've talked to like a lot of relatives and friends and all this stuff. A lot of them have kids, and they are very upset about the trans issue in schools. I'll put this is kind of a white pill, but also I'm trying to be realistic about this when I'm telling the story. And so they're very upset about the trans issue. And a lot of these people are extremely moderate. These are not Trump supporters. These are not people who have ever been into right-wing social issues. They generally think, like even some of these people thought the Tea Party was nuts, much less Trump. And they are really, really upset about the trans stuff in schools. And there's like a few other issues that you can see that definitely with parents, like with critical race theory in schools and other things. Like this really makes them upset. And you could even see that with declining standards and the emissions, the screwed up emissions that favor other races over whites and Asians. Well, this really gets people mad. But are these people ready to go to the next step of the Civil War or revolution? No, they're not. And some people were talking about this, that you do have these little enclaves or corridors that are unaffected by the outside negativity of society. I think Spotted Toad, or one of those accounts, was talking about how these club sports and athletic teams have become an enclosure for like normal kids to live out a normal childhood, and parents get those kids in sports so they don't become affected by the pause around them. And I think that's like exactly true. You can go to some really nice suburbs or other nice places in this country, mostly flyover America, but it's like primarily people with means who, are able to escape like the cities and other terrible things, and they go out on vacation there, and you'll see tons and tons of normal kids like work in the restaurants or out with their families and stuff. They're not all pink-haired kids who are dressing up as furries, but those parents are very much concerned about like the trans kids and the furries and like the weirdness that the schools are pushing, because they see their normal kids and they're worried that they may be turned into a furry. I'm not even like, that's not even like a joke. That like the parents, I think they do generally worry about this stuff for a lot of parents, but there still are normal people out there. But I saw like some person who went on a thread. It's like, they talk about how rural Americans are all losers and fat and obese and can't do anything. But like, I went to a JV football game, and the parents, they may have been overweight, but they're still good people and they're ready for war. And it's like, well, I would agree probably with that. They're probably good, solid people, but I don't think that those folks are necessarily ready for war just because of like, a drag queen story hour or something. They're very upset about it. But, to go to the next level requires a lot of other things to happen and a lot of cultural things, social and cultural changes to occur that are just not happening at this moment. I mean, America still has a pretty stable economy. And we also have, when it comes to the matter of like insurrections and stuff, if at least from when it comes from the right or disturbances from the right, the government still has the ability to crack down, forcefully on that. Just look at what they did to J6. Look at what they did to even like something like Charlottesville, which was like not a threat to anything, and how they came down hard on that. And and people are not ready to take those risks yet to go there. And I think, when we have that, I think the feeling of that we're heading to a civil war and that there's this mass partisanship or, balkanization, as you will, occurring, I think that is a sign that dissident right ideas are gaining more traction and people are more open to our ideas. But at the same time, I would not interpret that as like 50% of Americans saying we're on the brink of a civil war. I don't think that means we're on the brink of a civil war. And I do think we have to be careful with our rhetoric, because we unfortunately live in an insane asylum where people will then take this rhetoric and then do terrible things with it. And all that will lead to is innocence being lost and, a mass crackdown from the government. These things help the government. So you shouldn't be able to get into that, or you get entrapped by feds and you spend 20 years in jail for a crime cooked up by the federal government. So these are the things you got to worry about. And I don't want people to indulge in too much fantasy or too much, that like the victory is just around the corner. Like, this is going to be a long struggle for us. And I do think that there are positive things that are happening, that I think even people who are living great lives otherwise, they've got a nice home, they're able to, have a good car, and they have a wonderful family. But, when they take their kids out to a public location or they take their kids to a school, they're going to worry that it's not safe there anymore, or that they're going to be poisoned with woke ideology. And I think that people are waking up, but they're not waking up into a way that they're going to, have the revolution straight from V for Vendetta, but now it's based. And so I think people just need to be more grounded in reality and look at things from an objective perspective and how things are occurring, and to stop just like, pretending that a tweet, it means that revolution is on the way, and that we're just like fully giving people entertainment and just tweeting out things that are clearly not true just for retweets and likes. And, focus in on what we can actually accomplish, looking at the world realistically, and understanding that there are a lot of people who are open to our ideas, probably more so than at any point in time, but we're not, victory is not yet at hand. And there are things that need to occur, large scale events that need to occur in order for us to achieve total victory. So that's my thoughts on that. And once again, kind of a rant on this, but I think there's a lot of issues to cover with that. And hopefully you guys got really informed and your IQ was boosted. Now I'm going to go on to cognitive questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggested guests and topics if you sign up for the Cognitive Elite option at Highly Respected Substack, and that's at highlyrespected.substack.com. And if you haven't already, make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements while you're there. People love them. They say they're even more credible than the normal episodes. So this question comes from Tom. Tom asks about, there was this really goofy protest outside of a Turning Point USA event over the weekend where these guys were walking around with like swastikas and SS bolts and things. And Tom wants to ask, like, Scott, with other things that we've seen are being psyops, do you think that this was some type of op that occurred? Do you think that these were real people? And this is actually a good question, because I already saw that like people all automatically, if they ever see that there's something stupid, people automatically go to saying these guys are feds. Like whenever Patriot Front does like a demonstration, like I always say that Patriot Front is misguided at best. Misguided at best is way. I think their activities aren't very smart. That they need to change they need to stop what they're doing and focus on more fruitful activities. But I don't think that they're all feds. Probably is a federal informant who's well placed in the group, as is there are in a lot of these groups, as we've seen from J6 proceedings. But I don't think like every member is a Fed, and I don't think that like the FBI is like calling them out like, hey, we need you to discredit normal conservatives, like do a demonstration and make sure you're all worked out, like are all working out. I don't think that it's like that to that extent. But is somebody informing on them and telling like law enforcement or others like what's happening with the group? That's probably true. That's something different. So I've always been skeptical of those claims. But here in this instance, I'm a little bit more open to this. I don't think these were feds, and I think there was a tweet shared by somebody who pointed at a more likely culprit, and they pointed at the Lincoln Project. Now, the Lincoln Project did something similar during the Virginia gubernatorial race, where they had like 4 or 5 people like dress up like they were Identity Europa members at Charlottesville with white shirts and khaki pants and like tiki torches at a Youngkin event in Charlottesville. And everyone knew immediately that this was like clearly fake. There was like a black guy among them. There was like none of them looked like none of them looked like the typical person. And nobody has worn that stuff in like 4 or 5 years. Like they just looked, it was completely just like clearly an op. And people were just saying like, no, this is clearly a young alt-right fascist coming out for Youngkin. And then later on it turned out it was a Lincoln Project op. Now, this could be a Lincoln Project op, and I'm open to that idea. And then I looked into this a little bit more, and while I do think it is possible that it could have been a Lincoln Project op, I think that a lot of the people who were there are actually genuine neo-Nazis, and these people are that stupid. I think our side is that stupid to have them. I looked that up, and it was like seeing that like Antifa had actually been identifying some of these guys, and they were like NSM members or members of the Goyim Defense League, and they had been like another group that was like National Socialist of Florida who were there. And like these people do ridiculous stuff. Like I've seen like clips of the Goyim Defense League with like they'll rent a van and they'll put like SS bolts on it, like and runes, and they'll just go shouting out like anti-Semitic stuff, and like it's like it's like they're doing like real life internet memes and are doing internet memes in real life, and it comes off as like really bizarre. And what the hell is going on? You're like, it's so stupid that you would have to think that this is an op. But unfortunately, people actually do this stuff on their own and think it's great. The only thing that may have been coordinated with Lincoln Project was the DeSantis stuff. That was the only thing that I found odd, because these groups, they hate Trump, they hate any ordinary Republican, and they definitely don't even like DeSantis. And they had like this, they had one which like DeSantis's face and like a Nazi flag, but instead of a swastika, it's like DeSantis's face. They had another like DeSantis flag amidst like the Nazi flags, and you're like, that's a little odd. And so there's clearly people who were like actual genuine neo-Nazis, like it was not a total op. And they're not like feds, because they're like, I was looking at some of the people they were identifying, and they're like 18, 19, like, and then like the typical people that get arrested, like in Adam Waffen ops, when like the feds come and raid them, they're like the standard type of people that are doing this. And the feds aren't going to tell them like, hey, go protest outside of a TPUSA event. Like, they don't care that much about TPUSA to even do that. The only people who would want to do that, who would even care, is like Lincoln Project, who's trying to attack DeSantis to say that he's a Nazi. And so maybe there's a chance that like Lincoln Project like had some other group like of that sort had got in touch with those guys or some of these people and like, hey, I know you're gonna go show up there. Can you guys like have DeSantis stuff with you? And they're like, sure. And maybe that occurred. Now that's not. I'm not 100% certain that happened. Or I do think that somebody on their own decided to do DeSantis stuff so they get greater media attention and to troll. But I do find that part weird, and maybe thought that there was some type of like liberal group who had maybe knew that these guys were going to show up and wanted to do some like guerrilla activism and just said like, hey, can you do like DeSantis stuff so we can have like the mainstream media say like neo-Nazis rally for DeSantis? I could see that. But you can never underestimate the stupidity of people like that or people who they're not even on people on our side, but just people like that who are just like internet addicts who just think that like the real way to do politics is to wave like SS bolts around, and they think that like this is great optics or whatever. And so these people want to do Nazi LARPing. You've always had people like this. It's whatever. I mean, most people are just going to see them as clowns. They're clearly clowns, and there's nothing to get worried over. So whether it is an op or not, I'm usually doubt these things, but the one thing that makes my skepticism go off or makes me open to the idea was the DeSantis stuff, because, you know, a lot of people are trying to, even though of course I prefer Trump over DeSantis, like people like the Lincoln Project and others really do want to take down DeSantis, and they probably would have thought that this is like an easy way, is just like to get media to say like neo-Nazis rally for DeSantis. And they were even able to do this when there was like a small NSM gathering in Florida earlier this year, and they were just like on a random road in like out front of like a shopping center, and there's like 12 of them, and they're just like there's like NSM waving like swastikas and stuff, and like doing just like being idiots like in public. And there's like, well, you just have clowns everywhere, and there was like an entire media storm over how DeSantis is allowing Nazis to rally in the state. And it's like, well, we have the First Amendment. Idiots are allowed to rally for whatever reason. I think like 12 Nazis protesting on some random road in Florida is not a major concern. And like the media was like attacking DeSantis for allowing this to happen. Like, what is he supposed to do? Like send cops out to shoot them all? Like what's he supposed to do? Like, we have freedom of association. We have freedom to assemble. Idiots are going to assemble no matter what. So that's one thing that I think is that there was so much heat on DeSantis for that previous clown rally. It wasn't even a rally. It's like 12 people just standing on the side of the road. And that somebody would have been creative and be like, hey, these people are going to probably show up at TPUSA. Let's get them to wave DeSantis stuff. And maybe there was some coordination or an ass. So I think that I don't know what chances are. I don't think that's the most likely possibility, but I'm open to that possibility. So that's my answer to that question. And that is it for today. We're going to have another great IQ supplement later this week, so tune in for that. And of course, we're going to have another incredible episode next week. So until next time, stay respected.